Mr. Keitz is formerly a head of import, was a program manager in the import administration at the Department of Commerce. And there he headed a unit which was charged with investigating unfair trade practices, particularly and specifically dumping and illegal subsidies. Among the cases with which he was associated was the landmark dumping case against the Japanese and televisions in 1978. Mr. Keitz has been associated with the government's efforts against unfair trade practices, especially in the import area, for the last dozen years. He was with the Department of the Treasury before becoming a program manager at Commerce. He began his career with Customs in New York City, and he continued a career with Customs in Washington until he became a trade analyst in 1973. Mr. Keitz was born and raised in New York City. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the City College of New York and a master's degree in administration from Johns Hopkins University. I believe that our topic and the expertise of our guest match nicely. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Mr. Stuart Keitz.
Thank you, Dr. Bird. I'm glad to see my wife here tonight, and Lori Silloway from the Commerce District office. A couple of familiar faces make you feel a little more comfortable about this kind of thing. I'd like to say that I've never spoken before a group like this before, and I'm really pleased at the opportunity to have such a mixed group. Usually I'm talking to people who are in the industry who I don't have to explain a lot of things to, and so this is more of a challenge for me to make my points without being too obtuse about things. I've prepared a text that I'll try to read from as little as possible. I was under the impression that I would be required to speak for a very long period of time, so I prepared a very long text. In the process of looking it over, I realized how boring it was to read it. I thought it would probably be even worse to listen to it. So I'm going to make every effort I can to talk about the things I know about without spending too much time looking at this piece of paper. I think pretty well you understand what my qualifications are for talking about this subject. But I'd like to put in just a little more of a plug for the people on my staff and give you an idea of what we do, because so many times I talk to people on the telephone or at one meeting or another in the business community, and they barely have heard of the Department of Commerce, much less the fact that the Department of Commerce has the kind of program that we're responsible for, and I'm pretty proud of it, and I think it's the kind of thing that the country needs right now, and I'm going to talk to you about it now and hope that you'll feel the same way. Now, my office, as Dr. Bird said, has economists and industry specialists who study everything from the industry's economic and financial health to how it builds and sells its products. We examine all the regulatory issues, its employment, its unemployment problems, its competitive position both here and abroad. And a lot of people on the staff are what you might call car nuts. They just love to pore over all this data that they get from all the information services regarding the automobile industry. Others are not so much interested in the industry as they are in the international trade aspects. And they're working actively to promote U.S. automotive products abroad and working with the industry to improve its competitiveness. And when I say the automotive industry, I don't mean just the automotive manufacturers and assemblers. I'm talking about auto parts makers, the makers of those accessories, those little dice that hang on the mirror, and even the service equipment people. As a result, we've either analyzed or developed policy on every major automotive issue faced by the U.S. government in the last 6 years, which is about as long as this office has been in existence. I've been the director for a little over 2 years. In our time, we've led the administration's policy efforts on the domestic content fight. That is the effort to force through legislation a requirement that manufacturers in the United States put a certain amount of American material into the cars that they make. We've worked on the fuel economy standards that are largely responsible for your cars getting much better gas mileage these days, and on the Japanese voluntary auto export restraints, to name a few. We're currently involved in the U.S.-Canada free trade negotiations, and we're negotiating with the Japanese to open up their markets to U.S. auto parts manufacturers. We sponsored a U.S. auto parts pavilion at the Tokyo Motor Show in 1985. That was a big success, and we're going to do it again in 1987, which is the date of the next Tokyo Motor Show. Last week we wrapped up a very successful auto parts show that was the first of its kind in Seoul, Korea. And 45 American manufacturers participated in that trade show, and were very enthusiastic about the results. I had a call from the sales vice president of Allied Signal, specifically the people who make the Garrett turbochargers, and he said it was the best 3 days he's had in over a year. People were writing orders on the floor of the exhibition, and people are very excited about it. Having said all that, I've got a little story that my son told me once. That's a good lead-in for the rest of what I'm going to say. It seemed a Texas rancher was taking a vacation drive through New England when he decided to stop at a farmhouse and ask directions. The farmer was very hospitable and offered the rancher a refreshing drink. As they stood in back of the farmhouse, the farmer proudly pointed out the boundaries of his property. "This sure is a nice little farm you have here," remarked the Texan. "Of course, when I'm on my ranch back in Texas, I like to survey my property once in a while, too. Sometimes I get in my car and drive for hours before I reach the boundaries of my land." Well, the farmer looked around at his fields and said with a knowing look, "Yep, I had a car like that once." Well, now I probably wouldn't be wrong if I said that many of us have had cars like that at one time or another. I know my son has a car like that now. But I would also be correct if I said that we're less likely to have cars like that in the future. Good old economic principles like competition and consumer demand are important factors in this revolutionary change. But before those forces could lead the automotive world to new excellence, there had to be new standards, and the Japanese have given us new standards. I can remember a time not long ago when foreign cars were an oddity on American streets. Back in those days, the American auto industry was supreme in the world, and big American cars were status symbols on the streets of the world's major cities. At about that time, the first gas shortage came around. American competition in the United States had largely come to mean a fight for supremacy in the hearts and minds of chrome and fin lovers everywhere. But long gas lines and high prices quickly eroded the appeal of those cars, and the term gas guzzler became part of the American automotive consciousness. Nevertheless, the domestic industry and its labor force had become so used to its comfortable oligopoly that it responded only by downsizing a few products. Small car technology was not really seriously pursued. Why should it be? The government was keeping gas prices down, and threats of future shortages were probably only temporary. Meanwhile, the industry was financially sound. Sales had reached a record level in 1978 at 15.4 million units. Give you an idea, last year was a good year and they sold about 11 million cars. So that was a big year. And the industry made near record profits at that time. It wasn't until the second oil crisis established the credibility of the energy shortage that the domestics began to take serious note. By that time, the American consumer had stopped laughing at those boxy little cars running around the street that everybody associated with shoddy, cheap toys of a faraway Asian nation. They actually began buying those cars. More importantly, is they enjoyed the relative independence those cars offered from the gas pumps and long lines. They also began to perceive that in Japan, they not only made cars cheaper, they made them better. It's this perception, now firmly entrenched in the American marketplace, that still drives the market and probably will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Well, to complete the picture, the story moves into the 80s. The government has forced the domestics to dramatically increase their fuel efficiency through the corporate average fuel economy standards, who some people may have heard of as CAFE. Perhaps unfortunately, at the same time, the government pursued policies which slowed the rise of fuel costs. These were antagonistic policies, CAFE and the slowing of the fuel cost increases. On the one hand, forcing the industry to develop fleets of small, highly fuel-efficient cars on which they made little or no money. On the other hand, encouraging many consumers to continue demanding higher performance vehicles and larger cars. Other government actions led to Japanese restraints on automotive exports to the United States, and this gave the domestics some breathing room after the recession and losses of the early 80s. It enabled them to regain their footing and move strongly to profitability by the middle of the decade. However, the export restraint had other unexpected results. As we learned in basic economics, the artificial shortage drove prices up. Prices of domestically produced vehicles followed suit. And to add to the spiral, the Japanese, in seeking to regain or to obtain the profits that they would have had from larger volumes, which were now restricted, they began to import cars loaded with high profit options already installed. Well, it wasn't long before the age of low-priced Japanese cars virtually ended, and consumers got used to the idea that Japanese cars just weren't cheap anymore, but they continued to buy them. Some analysts began to talk of, quote, pent-up demand for Japanese vehicles. It seemed consumers would buy Japanese cars at any price. Even as the yen rose against the dollar, pushing prices ever higher, sales of the Japanese cars moved ahead undiminished. Only recently, in the last few months, has a price spiral run into a wall of some consumer resistance. Japanese inventories are beginning to build up now. What all those years of so-called pent-up demand has meant to the Japanese is mammoth profits. Profits so great, in fact, that the major Japanese manufacturers have prospered despite the fact the United States was their only profitable market. And with those profits came the resources for investment and research and development that would allow them to continue to frustrate the domestic companies' frantic efforts to catch up. The great success of the Japanese in the United States has focused the spotlight on the United States as the most lucrative market in the world for automobiles. Indeed, it's become the primary target of every country in the world that has dreamt of bringing in foreign capital through exports of motor vehicles. And there are a lot of those. New entrants into the U.S. market seem to be coming from everywhere. Now you see some coming in from Korea, Mexico, and Yugoslavia. Soon the streets will harbor nameplates from Brazil and Malaysia and Taiwan and Greece, Australia, Romania, and even mainland China. There will be German designs built in Korea for the North American market, or Italian designs built in Yugoslavia, or vehicles built almost anywhere with designs and components from all over the world. But it will be the Japanese who set the pace here. And it's a Japanese challenge that domestic industry will have to address effectively if it's going to survive. The most immediate problem the U.S. manufacturers face is how to regain the image of an industry that knows how to give the consumer an appealing, good quality product and do it profitably. This is not a new concept, but it's one that's fundamental to the success in this market, and it's a goal that will not be easy to attain. The industry is making good progress on several fronts. U.S. companies have moved to internationalize their operations. They're sourcing cars and components from the lowest cost supplier, internationalizing their management teams, and beginning to truly integrate their worldwide resources. At the same time, the efforts the industry has made to modernize its plants have been very impressive. Automation is being designed and implemented on scales that would impress even the Japanese. We've all heard, but to be sure, it doesn't work as it should at first. We've all heard the story about the robots in American auto plants that are painting themselves. But new technology takes time to perfect. In this case, the industry must rush forward into new and complex processes no one has any experience with if they're going to gain a competitive edge. And that'll take a lot of trial and error. Despite setbacks, progress has been good. Costs have been dramatically reduced. North American break-even levels have fallen from 11.2 million cars in 1980 to only 8.3 million today. The industry's financial health has improved considerably, but survival will require relentless cost reduction and greater consumer focus. On the macro scale, the industry's diversification programs are designed to strengthen the corporation's earnings, while hopefully contributing technologically to their future product offerings. However, more fundamental changes are sweeping the industry. At the product level, the industry is developing new base products from which will come the flagships for the rest of the decade. Products like Ford's Taurus, the GM10, and Chrysler platforms known as A and H bodies are essential to the future of the U.S. companies. Unlike their predecessors, these products must be good the first time off the assembly line. We all remember the days when we bought American cars, took them home, and for the first 2 weeks made up lists of all the things that were wrong with them. And then hopefully they all got fixed before we got rid of the car. Those days are gone forever. The market is no longer closed, and the consumer no longer expects any new model, much less models that have been on the streets for a while, to have first-time defects. The future of this industry rests more on the models that are coming out now than the end products of the highly publicized development programs like GM's Saturn project. Those products will compete in the 1990s, the Saturns. But the posture of the domestics in the 1990s and perhaps beyond that will be determined now by the cars they're selling in the late 80s. The nature of these products of the 80s is an indication of just how fundamentally the market for cars is changing. Model life cycles are becoming shorter. They're also quite different. Instead of the basic platform being used forever, as in the past, merely getting a new skin every now and then, its look is staying pretty much the same throughout its life, which now may be no longer than 5 or 6 years. And it will get shorter, because one thing that characterizes the challenge from Japan is the Japanese ability to introduce a completely new model, including superb new engines and transmissions, at least every 4 years. In the long term, it will be the Saturn program or Ford's Alpha and Chrysler's Liberty projects that will solidify a healthy industry. These enormously expensive programs are aimed at improving product quality and reducing manufacturing costs. These are exceedingly dynamic, challenging, and risky endeavors. There's no guarantee that their automated modular approaches will fulfill the hopes of their designers. But even if they do, they won't succeed very well if the products of the late 80s fail. An additional element in the fight to cut costs is the worldwide integration of corporate operations to improve economies of scale. This is viewed by outsiders as merely offshore component and vehicle sourcing. But less visible is the accompanying internationalization and rationalization of management structures. The U.S. auto companies have enormous worldwide resources, which once fully integrated can dramatically increase the industry's competitive posture. Perhaps more important, though, is a new management philosophy which is open to outside ideas and new technologies and is far more willing than ever to examine internal operations. They're willing to improve they're acting to improve interdivisional cooperation and to streamline their operations as never before. This new introspective spirit will ensure that the product is constantly examined for quality and consumer appeal. Attention to detail is the new creed of U.S. auto manufacturers. It has to be because it's the hallmark of their Japanese competitor. And so it has to become our interest. But it must be pursued consistently and relentlessly. And that's a goal that hasn't been reached yet, because you still find brand new American models coming out without the little features that consumers have shown they really like coin holders and storage pockets on doors and seat backs. Another very important area that demands attention is labor and plant management. It's disturbing that there are still strikes in this industry over working conditions. Modern automotive assembly plants should be clean and safe to work in. Labor costs will continue to be a problem. One disturbing aspect of this is that for the most part, the union is still battling to preserve high wages, inefficient multiple job classifications, and expensive work rules. If this industry is to be completely effective, labor costs must somehow be reduced. There are only two alternatives here: reduce wages or improve productivity. While the union shows signs in difficult times that it will accept some wage erosion and may be willing to adopt more flexible work rules in limited cases, they will certainly not volunteer or submit to sweeping changes easily. The result is that wage levels are expected to be a major problem for the industry. The manufacturers will make strong efforts in the coming years to negotiate greater management flexibility to reduce and manage the workforce with an aim toward greater productivity relative to cost. In the final analysis, though, the domestic producers must conclude that a solution to continuing high labor costs is technology. There is no other way to achieve the degree of productivity increase, quality improvement, and cost reduction necessary to compete in this ever more competitive market. Robotics, factory and office automation, the computerized integration of all aspects of the production process have been difficult to develop and even more difficult to implement. The upfront costs are high, but the promise of great leaps in efficiency is irresistible. Nevertheless, the workerless auto plant is not likely in the near future. Unlike the steel mill, the most modern of which is nearly devoid of human labor, the auto assembly line is so complex it will not be readily automated. And so, the success of the automakers' competitive efforts in this critical period must involve labor. The situation cries out for basic changes in traditional worker and management philosophies. Both sides must recognize that they are in this fight together. Like their counterparts in Japan, the American auto worker must recognize that his future is tied to that of the company. On the company's part, there must be a willingness to implement the lessons learned from observing the management practices of their Japanese competitors. Through cooperative efforts such as GM's joint venture facility with Toyota, which is known as NUMI out in California, U.S. industry has learned that the Japanese management skill is capable of winning the loyalty and hard work of even the most militant American laborers. This discussion of the U.S. industry can't be complete without mentioning the invisible players in this serious game. They're the independent parts and components producers who employ more than 650,000 Americans and whose futures are far more fragile than the automakers. The impact of the industry's efforts to improve competitiveness will fall heavily on them. The least competitive among them will fail. Their vulnerability is evident in the inability of some to comprehend sophisticated changes in their market environment. Nothing was more illustrative of this fact to me than the conversation last year with a sales executive of a U.S. auto parts firm. He was disappointed by his experience with a business contact my office had arranged with a Japanese automaker. He complained that, although we had told him the Japanese would be more receptive to his presentation than they had been in the past, they had still insisted on his company giving them a zero defect rate in the parts they supplied. Though this standard is a standard to which the Japanese hold all their suppliers, this gentleman concluded that the improved receptivity we promised meant that they would lower their standards for him, a standard he could never hope to meet. Even the strong competitors will find the going tough. The zero defect standard is quickly finding its way into U.S. purchasing practices, where our disappointed friend had found in a much simpler time in a much less sophisticated market that 5% defects were okay. In order to remain competitive, some of our parts producers will move offshore to cut their costs and maybe even improve quality. But they will be competing with Japanese parts companies who have begun assembly or manufacturing operations in the United States. There are already about 100 of these Japanese firms here. One estimate suggests that there could be 300 here before the end of this decade. These firms that are moving from Japan are already fully compatible with the demands of a zero defect system, while they have the advantage of already operating at lower costs and greater efficiencies than their U.S. competitors. The main advantage of the U.S. parts supplier is its established relationship with the U.S. automaker. Like their Japanese brethren, the domestic auto manufacturers are recognizing the advantages of long-term supplier relationships. And that's something that the U.S. suppliers can capitalize on. But the challenge to U.S. producers of auto parts will be to reach the efficiency levels of the Japanese before their American customers lose interest. The uncertainties of international trade were recently brought home to the parts suppliers when the dollar began its dramatic fall against the yen and other major currencies. While the currency realignment has improved their competitive posture against foreign firms and improved their export position as well, it also stimulated rumors that the monetary shift was accelerating the plans of the Japanese parts companies to move to the United States. In an effort to understand what the future holds for this industry, our staff constantly updates forecasts for new car sales. The current state of our forecast takes us through 1990. It shows a number of trends which bear some mention. The first is that we expect the Japanese to expand their market role into the realm of the U.S. industry's bread and butter bread and butter, larger car and luxury segments. Concurrently, the market share of U.S. cars will decline in this, their traditional stronghold. Our estimates imply that imports will rise from about 20% of the market in 1985 to about 37% in 1990. Japanese imports will increase from about 2.2 million units to nearly 3 million in the same period. Imports from other sources could add an additional 1 million units. We also expect the Japanese to increase their reliance on their U.S. assembly plants that are online presently or they are in the process of establishing. The question is, how much will they increase the utilization of these U.S. plants? With the added impetus of the lower dollar, plant expansion looks very attractive. We have not decided how to factor this in to the formula. But even so, our current forecast shows them selling nearly 1.3 million U.S. assembled cars here by 1990. In combination with the imported component of their presence, they would have about 38% of the U.S. market. As a result, we believe the market share of 72% held by the domestics in 1985 could fall to nearly 50% by 1990. The obvious question at this point is what the government will or should do about the problem. Further, what should U.S. government policy be in 1990 when these conditions may have already developed? Some would say government holds a trump card. A little protectionist legislation would go a long way towards preserving the health of this important industry. Others would be quick to point out that it was lack of competition that got the industry into the mess it's in now. Certainly, they wouldn't have to worry about remaining competitive, but what kind of products would be available to the U.S. consumer if there wasn't this outside challenge? Should we return to protectionism? We don't think so. We believe that there are several ways the government can help the industry, and protection isn't one of them. Besides, protectionist legislation would make a shambles of the forecast we've worked so hard on the last few years. Government should be pursuing policies that foster and encourage positive developments in the industry. Trade policy should not interfere with manufacturers' plans, and government should avoid policies which are inflexible and not in step with today's realities. Nevertheless, cries for protection or for government to do something will be loud. The reality, though, is that it will be difficult for the government to do anything at all in the future. Let's look at the realities of the political landscape just a few years down the road. At least 10 companies will be producing cars in the United States, 13 including Canada. If we add trucks, this means about 18 companies will be making motor vehicles in North America. The big three will be an entity belonging to history. No doubt the political power of the traditional U.S. manufacturers will still be formidable, but it will be reduced. It will be diluted by the Japanese manufacturers, now well-established American firms, who will find themselves increasingly drawn into national and local political issues. But if the thought of protectionist legislation is still appealing to you, let's look at the options. Number one, government can stop, hinder, or slow the imports. Obviously, this will be difficult because imports are already an essential part of the U.S. manufacturers' product lines or components in their own vehicles. There will be a choice, but the question will be, what are the trade-offs? Efficiency for jobs? That's going to be the question underlying all the deliberations in the next few years. We can protect, the second option is we can protect only part of the market. Imports can be restricted just a small segment. Even in 1990, that's feasible, but would be hard to do in a way that could not be circumvented. Number three, finally, we could develop a domestic content law. Not an economically wise course to take from the industry's point of view, because if they're forced to buy domestic products as components for their vehicles, those prices will go up and cars will become much more expensive to manufacture. and it would punish the consumer more than it will assist the industry. Besides, it will only force the Japanese to increase their manufacturing presence here, so it will only delay the competitive challenge and not remove it. So is protection the smart way to go? Well, I think that we should look at the lessons of history before we jump at an answer. No auto industry except Japan's has ever prospered under protectionist trade regimes. Certainly no country's auto industry has gone from free trade to protection and thrived. France is an example. But if government wants to protect industry, or is forced to protect it, and if it is convinced that industry can't be competitive, then I guess protection is the only way to go. However, there are a few who believe that government will not be so convinced. So we return then to what government can do. Well, it can, as I said earlier, avoid policies that are not in step with the times, that hinder industry instead of help. An example of the kind of unrealistic policy that I'm talking about is the continued pursuit of the corporate average fuel economy standards, a law that at this stage of its life accomplishes little that could not be done more efficiently by other mechanisms. Further, it could make problems worse, because the need to meet the standard of fuel efficiency that's legislated by the Congress and regulated by the Department of Transportation, the need to meet that standard in an environment that does not encourage consumers to buy the most fuel-efficient cars, meaning low gas prices, could drive the domestic auto manufacturers to move the production of their most profitable vehicles, the big cars, overseas. The result, obviously, would be loss of a substantial number of jobs and further regional dislocations. There are constructive roles for government. Some of them are already being pursued in offices like mine and others in the Department of Commerce that I know of. It is my philosophy that we need teamwork between government and industry. This is not the conservative view. I've heard plenty of criticism from those who believe that this country's greatness was born of the contributions of individual entrepreneurs, and it will be the individual who carries the day again. I can't argue with the first thought, but I can take issue with the second. Our industries find themselves in an open, free market. This isn't the U.S. market anymore. This is the world market. That probably is not going to change for the most part. The failure of Smoot-Hawley and other market-restricting measures have convinced enough people that closed markets just don't work. Why they don't work is fundamental to our system. We need competition. Competition that has surprises, uncertainties, and unreasonable advantages on the other side. This stimulates people to do their best. But like the administration likes to say, we need a level playing field. Well, I would add to that, we also need a team. Any of you who have been involved in children's team sports will know what I'm talking about. One of the best illustrations of the advantages of teamwork I have seen came to me on a soccer field. I had been the coach of a kids' soccer team for about 3 years. We had started off with a bunch of disorganized 8 or 9 year olds. Along the way, some of those kids got bigger and stronger than some of the opposing players, and some also developed some real individual skill. But suddenly, at the ripe old age of 11 or 12, they were over the hill. They couldn't score a goal against some opponents. The reason they couldn't even get near their opponent's goal is that some of their opponents had become teams. And through teamwork, their opponents controlled even the best individuals. Now, I had been yelling instructions from the sidelines for all of those 3 years about teamwork. Pass the ball, I used to say, and other team concepts. But I was largely ignored until they saw other kids doing it and using it against them. One day, those individuals on my team just walked onto the field, and suddenly they were a team. They started winning again. They started winning because teams need strong individuals, but they also need teamwork. Now, American industry still has some of the greatest individuals in the world, but their competitors in Europe, and especially Japan, have the best teams. You see a subsidy here, a government-supported R&D program there, an open door to local governments from distant countries who are anxious to offer tax write-offs and assistance to attract foreign investment. Sometimes it's just a little coordination offered by their government that gives a foreign competitor an edge. Sometimes it's just a state of mind. Many American firms don't want the government's help. They've done fine taking good advantage of the huge U.S. market that's all around them. Why should they think of exporting? Why should they think of cooperating with some domestic competitors in a little R&D? Why should they care what economic and trade theories of bureaucrats in Washington sit around talking about? Well, maybe they don't need us now, but a lot of them are beginning to be criticized for their short-sightedness. Those foreign teams may be targeting markets and thinking about market share in 10 years and planning for the day when their efforts will turn into profits. At the same time, the U.S. counterparts are often thinking about this quarter's financial statement and how it will look to the investors. Do you know that many internationally competitive foreign firms don't even have quarterly financial statements? I know I've painted a picture of unending challenges, but I believe they can be met. The rewards may not be what they once were, but there will be economic survival. The U.S. automotive industry is certainly much more competitive than it was only a few short years ago. Maybe by 1990 we will be looking at the increasing market share of the U.S. producers, but it appears more likely that we'll be talking about the Koreans or maybe someone else, the way we're talking about Japan right now. If we're to prevent this as the focus of future discussions, the auto industry cannot forget what it's been through, and the government must work not to interfere with industry, but to create an environment in which the U.S. industry can exercise its formidable strengths. Thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to listen to someone who spends their time working on a particular area of specialization, and then to have them share in a comprehensive way, in a thoughtful way, the full range of their observations and recommendations. And for that we thank you very much. But you're not finished. Stuart has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7, at which time we'll end promptly. And I'll ask all of you to remain with us until the time that the Q&A finishes. Now, yes.
My question for Mr. Keitz.
We'll ask Mr. Keitz to resume here, and first question is there.
Mr. Keitz, you mentioned, I'm a layman as far as the auto industry is concerned. You know, I can shift and all that, but that's about it. And I'm on this two-handed, and I work the radio with the other hand. You talked about the vast international resources of American auto firms, and what did you mean by that? I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, American auto producers particularly, have pursued for a long time a policy of manufacturing in the markets that they compete in. So unlike the Japanese and the Koreans, or at least the Japanese of several years ago and the Koreans today, they don't export cars to foreign countries. They manufacture them in the countries that they're in. This obviously gives them a very large manufacturing base from which they can exercise great purchasing power and other economies of scale that are far beyond the capabilities of even their Japanese competitors. Is that satisfactory?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Mr. Keitz, you mentioned companies cooperating on research programs. I once was involved with a government-sponsored program that called for bringing some competitors together on some research research involving energy conservation, and I found them very reluctant. Well, many of them just simply refused to come because of the fear of antitrust law violations relative to meeting, because research reads upon product configuration, which reads upon cost, which reads upon cost competitiveness, and all those things. Is that really feasible for American automobile companies to join together on research or anything else?
Well, it's been done now in several industries, and largely due to the fact that there was some legislation passed. The name of it escapes me at the moment, but there is an office in the Department of Commerce, which I'm seeking to utilize now to organize collective R&D programs for the U.S. auto parts industry. And they have helped several U.S. industries now take advantage of the provisions of this new law, which very effectively reduce the dangers of antitrust action when pursuing R&D programs.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you give us some idea of what orders of magnitude of money an auto parts show in, say, Tokyo produces in either orders or future business?
Well, they haven't produced much of anything yet. We had as I said, our first auto parts pavilion at the Tokyo Motor Show in November '85. It takes about a year for negotiations with a Japanese firm to bear any kind of fruit at all. And then from that point on, there's still many years of work to be done before anything is solidified, because in the auto industry, you typically have lead times of several years for product development that are specific to an automobile. Until that amount of time has passed, it's uncertain as to how large these contracts may be, but there are discussions going on as a result of the contacts that we fostered. We've done several other things in Japan that I haven't mentioned. We're working with the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry in a joint committee to examine the problems that American companies that are now having negotiations with Japanese companies into what kind of problems they're running into. And we try to resolve those problems as they crop up. And we're finding that a lot of the problems they run into are cultural. For example, as I mentioned, the Japanese negotiation process. In order to do business in Japan, you need to sit down with them many, many times to negotiate the same issues over and over again. That's just the way the Japanese do business. American companies like to hit and run. They give you a call and they wait for you to call back. Maybe they'll get around to calling you again in 6 months. And the Japanese culture views that as lack of commitment. And they don't want to buy from anybody who has no commitment. So to answer your question a little further, there's big money, very big money at stake in these contracts that are being negotiated now, and the doors that they will open for future American parts producers. But in the short term, there's no way of telling exactly how well that will do. There is one thing for sure: we have to resolve the cultural differences before we can move on to regular business negotiations. In this joint committee with the government of Japan, we've managed to successfully reunite some of the parties and some of the negotiations that had broken off simply because of misunderstandings like this, the belief on the part of the Japanese that the American company's casual attitude signified a lack of commitment. The Japanese don't want to do business with anybody who may disappear next year or raise their prices because their management practices are not financially sound. When you do business with a Japanese company, they want to come in many times, especially in the auto industry. They want to come in, they want to look at your plant, they want to examine your books, they want to see how you do business, they want to know how long you've been around and what the backgrounds are of all your executives. And a lot of American companies are unwilling to do business that way.
Yes, sir.
You said that there have been Japanese companies that have come to the United States and have exhibited managerial techniques that have allowed them to gain the allegiance of the American workers in
Yes.
their factories. You also strongly implied that today in the American auto industry, there is still a problem between the employees, the union members, and the management. And so how did the Japanese overcome this? Can you have some details about their technique? How do they differ? It seems like a miracle.
Well, it seems like a miracle to a lot of people, especially those who have seen it. The plant that I referred to is the plant in California that manufactures the Chevy Nova. It's now also manufacturing Toyota model. The Chevy Nova today is a Toyota Corolla with American facelift. And Toyota is managing and operating the plant. And GM is learning a great deal from this because that particular plant had a reputation several years ago as one of the worst plants in the American auto industry. It had a rabid union local. They couldn't seem to get anything done. The quality of the products was terrible. Absenteeism, alcoholism, everything was a problem at that plant. Well, Toyota came in and they instituted Japanese management techniques. Now, Japanese management techniques are, for the most part, techniques that grew out of studies in the U.S. War College in the late 1940s, but no American manufacturers wanted to use them. The Japanese have put them to work very effectively. And I must say that it's partly because of the differences in culture. Their culture is readily amenable to a system that requires mutual respect and cooperation. The American auto industry has traditionally had an adversarial relationship between union, labor, and management. And so what we see when we go through the Toyota GM plant in California is workers on the line who will tell you that they feel like they are a part of management, that they feel like they count. A Ford executive was once quoted as saying, just before his retirement, he took a tour of the NUMMI plant in California, and he said, you know, for all these years, we've been telling workers what to do. Now I finally find out, after going through this plant, that I should have been telling them to do what they think is right. And the Japanese say that this is what people respond to, that when you tell them to do what they think is right, for the most part, people will do what they think is right. And they'll solve problems on the manufacturing floor, and they do solve problems. One of the things you'll see on the NUMMI assembly line is a mirror set up at a curve in the assembly line, where the people operating one of the merging parts of the system can see what's happening around the bend. There had been several problems with something not meshing properly in the assembly line, and what happened at that time was that they stopped the assembly line. They got all the workers together from the particular area in which the stoppage occurred, and they all discussed it until they came up with a solution, a nice simple mirror set up on the floor at that point. And this is the kind of thing that has won the loyalty of those workers. And today, Toyota will tell you that they get the same quality out of those former GM employees that they get out of their employees back in Japan.
Mr. Stern? The next question.
Next week, the House of Representatives is going to vote on the Gephardt amendment.
Yes.
How would that amendment specifically affect the automobile industry if it were to become law?
Well, it essentially would put great restrictions on the Japanese. it escapes me right this minute what all the provisions are. I'm a little, I think I have a little stage fright. I can't recall the exact nature of the provisions in the Gephardt Amendment, but if I recall correctly, it will force the Japanese manufacturers basically to have a certain degree of U.S. content in their cars. So, am I recalling correctly?
Well, it would require a reduction, a specific monetary reduction in the size of the trade imbalance.
Yes.
Bilateral trade
Right.
imbalance.
I was thinking of the process rather than the actual law. But in order to reduce that deficit, they're going to have to buy a lot more American components, because that will greatly increase the domestic content, the U.S. content of the cars that they manufacture, and thereby reduce that trade balance, because those cars, and it's largely cars that are contributing to the automotive trade imbalance between the United States and Japan. It's those cars, if they contained a large percentage of U.S. parts, would certainly have a great effect on the imbalance. And it is a very big problem, because I think there was something like officially a $56 billion trade imbalance between the United States and Japan. $32 billion of that was automotive. Only $3.6 billion of it was parts. And the Japanese currently are only buying about $300 million worth of U.S. parts.
Yes.
Regarding the praising the workers for doing good work, I believe there's hope for our industry, because, of course, I took at the middle school 8 years ago on raising children. Told it was systematic training for effective parenting. You were to ignore basically the wrong they did and praise them for the good, and it does work. And apparently it's working for the Japanese in their auto plants. And now we have a whole generation of young people coming up whose parents have been exposed to this way of teaching. And isn't there hope then?
Well, I think so, and it's basic human nature, and the Japanese culture really lends itself to that, because if you've ever been in a Japanese company, it's interesting to see that not only doesn't the president of a big company